My hope really wasn't to buy any votes with the gun, but to leave you with a visual symbol, basically, of my dad's position on guns. He's been in Congress for 10 terms now and never voted for any federal regulation on firearms. So hardcore is he, in fact, that he's voted no even when the NRA went along with certain legislation like trigger locks. Ron Paul still voted no. He thinks those things, if you're going to want things like that, do it in your state. Let your state legislature take care of it, but it's no business of Washington. With regard to where we're going, where the party's going, where you're going, and what direction you're going to send the Montana party, you have to make some decisions. One of the biggest messages so far of the primary season is that the Republican Party is shrinking. In Iowa, 3 times as many Democrats voted as Republicans. In Nevada, same thing, 3 times as many Democrats. In New Hampshire, 1.5 times as many Democrats as Republicans. We don't have the results yet from South Carolina. The party is shrinking, though, and we have to understand why it's shrinking and have to decide as a party. You in Montana, myself in Kentucky, our supporters across the country have to decide what we're going to do about it. I believe the reason the party is shrinking is that we failed in our promises. We have a great platform. My dad stands up on the stage and they ask him, why are you a Republican? How do you fit in with this group? He may not fit in with the group on the stage, but if you read the Republican platform, he is the Republican platform to a T. We have not followed our platform. The Republicans have always believed in balanced budgets. We've run on them since the 80s. Reagan had a great message. My dad was one of the first Reagan supporters in 1976, one of only 4 congressmen who had the guts to stand up for Reagan in 76. But you know, under the 8 years of Reagan and the 4 more years of Bush, the deficit's mounted. Now, if you just want to apologize for Republicans, you can say, oh, it was the Cold War, we had to spend all this money. Well, you know, it's not exactly true. If you analyze the money spent in the 80s and the 90s, it was spent on domestic spending. Domestic spending went up more rapidly in the 80s than it did under Carter. We now have 7 years of a Republican presidency and a Republican Congress for the most part, and we've added $3 trillion worth of debt. Once again, if all you care about is, oh, I'm a Republican, I don't care about balanced budgets and all that stuff, I just want to be a Republican, then just turn me off because this isn't going to be worth listening to. But if you really believe in issues and you became a Republican because you believed in limited government or balanced budgets, please listen on. Of the $3 trillion that we've added in debt since the year 2000, about $1 trillion of it's been the war in Iraq, and we'll get to that in a minute. But $2 trillion of it's been domestic spending increases. Domestic spending has gone up faster under George Bush than it did under Bill Clinton. I've been a Republican my whole life. My dad's a Republican, my grandparents were Republicans, but I tell my Republican friends just to needle them and rub it in. I said, George Bush has made Bill Clinton look like a fiscal conservative. Now, it wasn't all Bill Clinton's doing. We had divided government then. We had a Republican Congress and Bill Clinton as Democrats, and they fought to gridlock a lot of times, but you know what? Gridlock's not that bad. You know, there was some restraint with gridlock, and maybe we should think about that. In fact, the USA Today did a survey of all the different states, and you know what the most frugal government is? The most conservative government. Doesn't matter which party, as long as it's divided. If you've got a Republican governor and a Democrat Congress, you get pretty fiscal conservatism. You have the opposite. If you have all Republicans or all Democrats, it hasn't done as well historically. And that's a problem. We need to think about that and consider that. But we need to know, why did spending explode under the Bush administration? There are several big items. Number one, prescription drug plan for senior citizens. Sounds good. Senior citizens have to have a lot of medicines. Shouldn't we just give it to them for free? Well, I mean, as Republicans, we're supposed to be smarter than the concept of Santa Claus. You know, we can't just give things to people for free. Someone's got to pay for it. You know, but you know how many Republicans voted against that? And George Bush twisted every arm. You have a conservative over in Idaho who was going to vote no, but they twisted his arm night and day and finally got him to vote yes, and it just barely passed. I don't know how your Montana congressman voted, but I know there was only about 30 Republicans who voted against it. They said it would be $400 billion. It's turned into $1 trillion. It'll be probably more because these open-ended entitlements get larger and larger and larger. One thing for certain, it's the largest entitlement passed since the Great Society. We're not the party of the Great Society. That was LBJ. We kind of grew up to despise that. We were Republicans because we weren't LBJ. We weren't part of this big, massive government expenditure system. But we failed. You know, it's not just that, it's the transportation bills. We have more earmarks on the transportation bills than we've ever had. And here's something that I'll bet you nobody in this room knows. You know, there's a big hullabaloo about that bridge to nowhere up in Alaska, $250 million bridge to an island of 50 people. You could have bought everybody on the island a Learjet for the price of this bridge. Big public stink about it. They took the earmark off. You know where the money goes? Still goes to Alaska. The governor's going to build the bridge. He's told everybody he's going to build the bridge and still name it after Ted Stevens or the other guy, Don Young. We can't, you know, we have to win the battle. We have to follow through. Taking the earmark off wasn't enough. The earmark just directs where the money goes. The earmark doesn't spend any money, it just directs where it's going to be spent. But those are Republicans. The difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is you'll get more highway projects in Republican districts when the Republicans are in power. When the Democrats are in power, you get more highway projects in their district. But that's not what a lot of us are about. It's not why we're interested in it. If it were only who gets the highway funds or where it gets spent, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't even participate. I wouldn't even be a voter if that's what I was about. If it was just, it's got to be about ideas and issues. And if we don't believe in balancing budgets, why participate in this? Why even make a charade of this? Now, why does a balanced budget? Is it just a number on a sheet that's important? No. When you run up $500 billion deficits in a year, you have to finance them. Part of the financing is going on by foreigners buying the debt. The Chinese are buying a lot. The Japanese are buying a lot. But part of the debt is paid off through monetization. This means it's the Federal Reserve monetizes the debt. They create money. They create easy credit. And that's how the housing boom got started. When you create easy credit, you lower the interest rate below the market rate of interest, and you spur a boom that is bigger than the marketplace would have allowed, and then there's eventually a correction. We're now seeing the correction. But what do the other people on the stage with my dad say? They roll their eyes when he talks about the Federal Reserve, and they say, oh, well, Ron, let's just lower the point, you know, lower the rate a half a point. Well, that's this little stopgap measures, but ignores the fact that by setting the interest rate too low in the beginning is how the boom got started, and now we're going through the bust cycle. But it's all interrelated. The Federal Reserve doesn't do this because they don't have good intentions. They're trying to stabilize things, but they're having to do this because you have $500 billion deficits in a year. So you have to decide, do you want a government that spends only what it takes in, or can you live beyond your means for this long? We've done it for a long time because we buy more imports than exports, and so our dollars go overseas, and people have kept those dollars overseas as backing for their currencies. But it's not going to go on forever. People are leaving the dollar. There's a dollar crisis. I mean, I think it's worrisome when my brother calls me earlier this week and says, I've heard the futures are down. My brother never calls me. He says the futures are down overnight overseas. When people who are not involved in the marketplace are starting to worry about the marketplace, that means something's afoot. The Federal Reserve gets involved in an emergency fashion this last week. We live in sort of perilous times, and we have to decide what our philosophy is as a party and which direction we want to go. Well, is Ron Paul different than any of the rest of the candidates? Yeah, he always has voted no against these things. He voted against Bush budgets. McCain votes for all the Bush budgets because, like a lot of the Republicans, they think you can't vote against a Republican budget. But with all the deficits, it's made it worse. What about, what would Ron Paul do? Ron Paul would veto any budget that wasn't balanced. Now, they might override his veto, but you'd have a grand debate in this country finally over budgets. You know, we wanted Reagan to veto a budget or to have balanced budgets, and he didn't do it. And it wasn't anything personal against him. I think his philosophy was good. I just don't know that he had the energy or the follow-through to get what we needed. You know, he proposed getting rid of the Department of Education. That still, for many years, has been part of the platform. But nobody talks about it anymore. Instead, under George Bush, we've doubled the size of the Department of Education. We've passed No Child Left Behind, which has increased the concentration of power over education in Washington. We as Republicans used to believe in decentralized education. We thought the states and the localities should be the ones in charge of our schools. You know, Governor Huckabee, conservative in some ways, but a big supporter of No Child Left Behind. Governor Huckabee, conservative in some ways, but, you know, also voted for restrictions on homeschoolers in her states. Governor Huckabee, conservative on some social issues, agrees with us on a lot of the social issues, but economically wasn't very conservative in his state. The Club for Growth has put out reports on his record in Arkansas, on the number of taxes that were raised during his stay in Arkansas. You'll get a more of about the same that you're getting now. You won't get much different than what you've gotten from the current administration. What about some of the other issues? What about immigration? Governor Huckabee hasn't been that great on immigration either. Governor Huckabee's for scholarships for illegal immigrants. He hasn't been at all for much security at the border until recently. Romney's been on both sides of that issue, but then again, he's been on both sides of most of the issues. Romney's much more conservative today than he was when he ran for Senate or when he ran for governor in Massachusetts. And you have to ask yourself deep inside, is that a new conversion and a believable conversion, or is that something that represents an opportunism now that he's running in a very conservative primary? But you might hear all this and say, oh, well, Ron Paul, he's pretty good, and I'd vote for him, but man, he can't win. Why should I bother? Why should Montana vote for him? But you know, one thing you might want to think is that there is a practical argument. I try to present the principled reason because I hope that you are motivated by principles. But there's a practical argument also, and the practical argument is, you know, the national media is not paying much attention to Montana or Ron Paul. You want to break out? You want to do something extraordinary? You want to do something that will put you all over the national news and send a message to the entire country? You want to send a message that you really don't like deficit spending, that you don't like higher taxes, that you don't want federal control of your education? You'll send no louder and no clearer message than vote for Ron Paul, and I guarantee they'll hear you. Think about it. Think about it long and hard. Think about the principled reasons for voting for him. Now, some of you may nod your heads and say, yeah, but what about this foreign policy? You know, I'm afraid that Ron Paul's not strong on defense. Well, what I would say is that Ron Paul believes that government at the federal level should operate under the enumerated powers. And one of the enumerated powers, very specifically, is national defense. So if you were to ask Ron Paul what are the primary functions of government, he would say that the national defense is the most primary of all the functions of the national government. But does that mean that you have a blank check, basically, for the military-industrial complex? That's no. We have to use our brain. As conservatives, we say throwing more money at a problem doesn't always fix it. But then when we're conservatives, all of a sudden we lose our brains and say, oh yeah, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there to Halliburton. No big deal. We just keep spending with no restraint. So if he takes the same fiscal conservatism that he takes to all spending and applies it to defense, now, he's not alone in this. The first one to mention and worry about the military-industrial complex was none other than Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower brought this up, and Eisenhower knew a little bit about military and the procurement problems, you know, and he was no stranger to this. But we need to recognize that as Republicans and realize that we can't give a blank check to the military either. So what does this mean about terrorism? Can we just appease terrorists and let them attack us at will and not do anything about it? Well, not at all. Ron Paul voted to go into Afghanistan. If anything, he thinks we made the mistake by not going in soon enough. One of the people who advises my dad is Michael Shore. He's a 25-year veteran of the CIA and has written a book, Imperial Hubris, and I recommend it for reading. It's a great book. But Michael Shore says that one of the key mistakes we made was actually waiting 20 or 30 days to go into Afghanistan, because terrorists are very weak people. They have no army, they have no military, no navy. They can only exert their threat through, you know, blowing themselves up or blowing planes up and doing dramatic things, but they have no army. So when you try to go after them, they disperse. So you'd have to get them very quickly. So Ron Paul would have gone in immediately into Afghanistan. But Afghanistan was different than Iraq. The hijackers were primarily from Saudi Arabia, almost all of them, and they trained in Afghanistan. There was a direct link there. There was no link between terrorism or any terrorism in Iran. In fact, in Iraq. Iraq had been our ally for 20 some odd years. We'd funded Hussein. We'd probably bought most of his military hardware because we always used Hussein as sort of this useful but evil bulwark against the Shiites in Iran. In fact, there's a great YouTube clip that everybody should look up, and it's Dick Cheney in 1995 being interviewed on why they didn't go into Baghdad the first time under the first George Bush, and his arguments are exactly mirroring my dad's arguments for why we shouldn't have gone in this time. It would be chaos, there'd be a civil war, there'd be no exit strategy, and it'd cost a blue bloody fortune in both lives and treasure. And this is Dick Cheney saying this. But, you know, a couple $100 million later, Dick Cheney earns from Halliburton. He comes back into government. Now Halliburton's got $1 billion no-bid contract in Iraq. You know, you hate to be so cynical that you think some of these corporations are able to influence policy, but I think sometimes they are. Most of the people on these committees have $1 million in their bank account, all from different military-industrial contractors. We don't want our defense to be defined by people who make money off of the weapons. We want our defense to be defined by what is an appropriate defense. You have John McCain now in the primary who says he'll leave the troops there for 100 years if necessary. John McCain goes around to his rallies and he loves to do a little song and dance where he sings to the Beach Boys song, but he sings bomb, 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 Iran. You know, is that the kind of sort of, you know, frivolous way we want to look at war? War should be the most important vote that a congressman ever takes. When it came up for the Iraq War, my dad's on the International Relations Committee, he said, let's have a debate and let's vote on declaring war. The chairman of the committee is a Republican. He said, that part of the Constitution is an anachronism. We don't pay any attention to that anymore. We haven't declared war since World War II, and we've gotten into some problems where we have no clear message on which way we're going with some of these wars because we don't come around them as a nation and declare war. The vice chairman or the ranking member on the minority side that said, bring up the Constitution, said, Ron Paul, you're making this into a frivolous debate. They finally did allow him to debate, and then they all voted against declaring war, and then they voted to give authority to go to war. The danger to an open-ended authority is that George Bush's administration maintains that they have the authority to go to war in Iran now with no voting. I mean, whether you agree or disagree with my father's ideas for foreign policy, you must agree that we should follow some rules about how we go to war. I mean, war is so important and so tragic that we should only go when we do it in a proper constitutional fashion. They maintain they can go into Iran with no further voting. Recently, the National Intelligence Estimate came out and it said Iran's not building and hasn't been working on a nuclear bomb for 4 or 5 years. Iran cannot even refine their own gasoline. We have to help them, Western or European companies, help them get the oil out of the ground. It's sent to Europe and refined and sent back. I find it hard to believe that a country that can't refine their gas is somehow a threat to our national security. My father is concerned that by having our ships 1 mile off the coast of Iran, that we're inviting an accident. When those speedboats came up the other day, one of them could have blown up a ship. They could have been full of some kind of explosive device and blown a hole in one of our ships. But if our ships are 20 miles, at least 20 or 30 miles off the coast, those speedboats aren't going to be out there. Our ships can launch missiles. We can launch missiles from thousands of miles away. Why do we need to be right a mile off the Iranian coast? You know, we need to be very careful. There's going to be some kind of accident and we'll be in another war. We need to figure out what is going on with terrorism. We need to figure out why they attack us. Some Republicans don't want to hear this, but I live near Fort Campbell and there's 50,000 soldiers there. And I tell people, you have to imagine your feelings, and you have to truly imagine what your feelings would be if those soldiers were Chinese soldiers and they were occupying the United States. We wouldn't have it. Republican and Democrat, we'd be setting the roadside bombs, blowing up the Chinese soldiers as they came off the base. No country wants foreign soldiers on their land. We're now building a $500 billion embassy in Iraq. Takes up 140 acres. It's bigger than the Vatican. Takes up the prime riverfront property along the Euphrates, which is probably priceless. We're building 10-foot tall walls, 10-foot thick. Then there's a courtyard and then another series of 10-foot walls. It's like a medieval fortress. We're building 14 permanent bases in Iraq. We have such sophisticated weaponry that no one can challenge us militarily in the world, but we don't need to be provoking these crazy people by being in their countries. Will they sell us the oil still? They have to sell the oil. They want to exist. They'll go back to being Bedouins in the desert if they don't sell their oil. So, I mean, there is no reason people say, oh, we have to be there for the oil, if that's a practical reason for being there. Well, the price of the oil has tripled since we've been there. So even the practical arguments haven't worked. And I know this is a difficult subject for people, but I want people to be assured that my father does believe in a strong national defense. He believes that it's the primary function of the national government. He believes that we shouldn't be sending our border guards to teach the Iraqis how to control the Syrian border. We should have them on our border. My father believes with regard to immigration that we should not, as Governor Huckabee has been in favor of, giving scholarships and welfare to illegal aliens. We should stop and eliminate that. We should bring our border guards home from Iraq and have them on our southern border. My father also believes that we should have an end to birthright citizenship. If you come here legally and your kids are born, they should be citizens. But if you come here illegal and your kids are born, we should change the rules. No reason we can't. So there are some things that I think a lot of you in this room would agree with Ron Paul. You have to get beyond some things that you may be challenged by, but you have to ask yourself in the final analysis, do you want the status quo? Are you happy with adding $3 trillion worth of debt? Are you happy with no child left behind? Are you happy with, nationalized prescription drug plan for senior citizens? Do you want a truly limited constitutional government? You've got the first choice you've had in a generation. And I hope you'll think long and hard about it, and I hope you will consider voting for my father. Thank you.